Ancient Persia. Fearless, formidable, resilient. For centuries it was cloaked in mystery, an empire unparalleled in its conquests and its riches.
To create an empire of the size of the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had known, obviously takes military skill.
Stretching at its zenith from North Africa to Asia, Persia was a civilization driven by a dynasty of ambitious and fiercely autocratic rulers.
Cyrus the Great is one of the few who deserves to be called the Great.
The Persian Empire gave rise to some of the best examples of fantastic engineering in the ancient world. Magnificent palaces that rose up out of the barren desert, and roads and bridges and canals.
Everyone has heard of the Suez Canal, but how many have heard of Darius's Canal?
But dark times were looming. Old rivalries with Greece erupted into an epic clash that changed the course of history and shaped the Western world for hundreds of years to come. (330 BC). A young Macedonian king invaded the Persian Empire and led a victorious army into Persepolis, its capital city. The Macedonian was Alexander the Great, himself an admirer of Persian culture and history. By sunset, the Greek victory celebration degenerated into a drunken brawl. By dawn, Persepolis, the crown jewel of the Persian Empire, graced with architectural marvels unlike any other in the world, was burned to the ground. More than 2,500 years later, these ruins still stand as testimony to the dizzy heights this now forgotten civilization once reached.
I equate Persia with luxury, with rich tapestries and beautiful rugs and my mother's fat, fuzzy Persian cat named Otis. But I also think of a fantastic Persian king named Cyrus the Great, who believed in religious and cultural tolerance, and who freed the Jews from Babylon to return to Israel. Hello, I'm Peter Weller, and welcome to the Persian Empire. Around 4000 BC, two nomadic tribes were starting to take root in a rich but hot Iranian plateau, the Medes in the north, the Persians in the south. Being as that these tribes were nomadic, they were more interested in survival than conquest. As they became less nomadic, they had to learn how to farm, in particular how to cultivate this fertile Iranian plateau. But to do that, they needed a source of water. The early Persians may have very well become dust in the winds of history had they not unlocked a source of water and, just as importantly, a means to channel that water to their crops and settlements. And what makes this engineering feat so remarkable is that they found this water not from rivers or lakes or oceans, but from the most unlikely source of all, rocks.
Persia emerged out of nowhere, a rugged, hostile landscape transformed only by invention and determination. 3,000 years ago, nomadic pre-Persian tribes roamed the parched Iranian plateau. Finding water necessitated traveling long distances. It fell to a hybrid engineer-geologist water diviner called a Mogani to work out how to take it back to the people. Using only primitive stone chisels, Moganis laid the cornerstone of the Persian Empire, a breakthrough system of underground irrigation channels called qanats. They began by harnessing gravity to exploit the natural topography of the land, which sloped down from the Alborz Mountains towards the Persian Gulf. First, a vertical shaft was dug, and then a channel was excavated horizontally from it for a short distance. Then another vertical shaft was dug approximately 3/4 of a mile up the slope, and so the channel was continued.
It can be sometimes 20, 30, 40 kilometers away, so it's a very skilled operation, to the point where the gradient of the water channel meets the aquifer, or the groundwater, sloping up at the point where the mountains begin.
The angle of the slope was critical, 1 unit in elevation to every 100 along the horizontal.
Not too steep, because that would erode the base of the water channel, and of course not so flat as to prevent the water from moving to its intended destination.
2,000 years before Rome's legendary aqueducts were conceived, the Persians were channeling huge amounts of water over long distances in hot, dry conditions with only minimal loss to leakage or evaporation.
Water means food, but the engineering technology to locate that water and move it was a carrot that the Persians were dangling in front of their neighbors. Around 700 BC, all of these tribes were united under one legendary figure named Achaemenes, who founded a dynasty. But this dynasty thrived and flourished under one guy, a guy I would have liked to have met, named Cyrus the Great. Cyrus created and maintained an empire thanks, no doubt, to his military savvy, but he was also a political genius. He was an excellent, benevolent manager of men. Historians have called him humanist. The Jews call him Mashiach, or Anointed One. His own people called him Father, and even the Ionian Greeks, whom he conquered, called him a just and worthy lawgiver and ruler.
Cyrus the Great came to power in 559 BC. He inaugurated the Achaemenid dynasty. Its achievements and exploits changed the course of history in the Middle East and magnified the possibilities of architecture.
If you're looking at the greatest personages in history who have affected the world, Cyrus the Great is one of the few who deserves that epithet, the one who deserves to be called the Great. The empire over which Cyrus ruled was the largest the ancient world had ever seen, and may be to this day the largest empire ever.
By 554 BC, Cyrus had vanquished all his rivals to become the undisputed leader of Persia. It was time to conquer the world. And if he was going to create an empire, he would need a magnificent capital city to reflect its growing stature. Cyrus embarked on one of the most ambitious engineering projects anywhere in the ancient world. It was the Persian Empire's first capital, at Pasargadae, now located in modern Iran.
Cyrus was a very innovative builder, and I might add that his standards were particularly high. We can also say that his building project reflected in some ways the technologies that he found in the course of his various conquests.
Like the Romans centuries later, the Persians were inveterate borrowers. They took the best and most advanced ideas from the cultures they conquered, then developed them even further into technologies uniquely their own. The art and engineering of Pasargadae drew on influences as far-flung as Assyria, Egypt, and Asia Minor.
There were stoneworkers, woodworkers, brick makers, relief makers, and we know that these were people often imported from all over the empire.
Today, over 2,500 years later, these crumbling remains are the only evidence of what was once here, Persia's first blossoming capital city. In the center were two magnificent palaces, surrounded by a park and acres of formal gardens. Among them was the first example of the Paradisia, the quartered, walled Persian garden containing lilies, roses, cherries, and pomegranate. It was a paradise, watered by 1,000 yards of limestone irrigation channels designed so that the water filled a myriad tiny pools. The Paradisia laid the foundations for many of the world's loveliest gardens from then until now.
What's particularly different with the Paradisa is the application of the geometric design. So we have squares, rectangular designs, floral designs, cypress trees, wild grasses, roses, lilies, all kinds of vegetations. And this is the concept of the modern park as we know it.
While Pasargadae was being laid out, Cyrus added one enemy kingdom after another to his dominions. But Cyrus was a very unusual conqueror, in that he refused to enslave his new subjects. This was a revolutionary concept in the ancient world.
He recognized the local validity, if you will, of different religions and beliefs, and allowed those things to persist.
In 539, Cyrus conquered Babylon, but he did not present himself as a conqueror. He presented himself as a liberator, rescuing these people from their despotic ruler. And then he did a totally unprecedented thing. He freed the Jews. The Jews had been living in Babylon in captivity ever since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and their temple, and Cyrus freed them. Now, it could be said in hindsight or political history that Cyrus was looking for a buffer state between a hostile Egypt and his own empire. But so what? The point is that no one had ever done anything like this, and hardly anyone has ever done anything like it since. And subsequently, he is the only Gentile in the Bible to be referred to as Mashiach, or Messiah.
As one distinguished Oxford scholar once said to me, Cyrus always had a very good press. It's a very true statement.
But in 530 BC, before he could launch the campaign that would establish Persia as the sole superpower of the ancient world, Cyrus the Great died in battle at the fine old age of 71.
He didn't live long enough to show what really he could have done outside the battlefield. So in that sense, you can compare him with Julius Caesar, who conquered, but did not live long enough, he was assassinated, to put the empire that he conquered together.
By the time Cyrus died, the Persian Empire had three capitals: Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana. But he chose to be buried in the city he himself created, Pasargadae, in a tomb that aptly reflected the man who built it.
At Cyrus's tomb, one of the aspects that shows his humility is that tomb is relatively unadorned, very simple, very elegant.
The tomb was built in the style of simple but imposing Western structures. The engineers began by laying large rectangular cut stones as a base. Then they used ramps, pulleys, and clamps to erect the burial chamber on top.
The Tomb of Cyrus is a very simple, outwardly modest monument for somebody who had created the largest empire that the world had seen to that date. And it's still remarkably well preserved after 25 centuries.
For 30 years, no power on earth could stand up to Cyrus the Great. But in 529 BC, his dynasty was in jeopardy. His death left a power vacuum that would throw the ancient world into chaos. In 530 BC, Cyrus the Great, the architect of one of the world's first true empires, was dead. For Persia, the future hung in the balance. Rivals and pretenders to the throne vied for supremacy. Then, a distant cousin of Cyrus, an able general, made his bid for the crown. When the smoke cleared, the Persian Empire was securely in his grasp. His name was Darius. He would become, arguably, the greatest of the Persian kings, and one of the finest builders in the ancient world. Darius wasted no time. He began by rebuilding the old capital of Susa, adorning it with new palaces faced in shiny glazed brick. The magnificence of Susa was even recorded in the Bible.
When the Greeks talk about Persian palaces, for example, they routinely mention Susa. When the Old Testament book of Esther talks about Persian palaces, it's Susa that they mention.
But the new ruler wanted a ceremonial capital all of his own making. 518 BC, Darius laid the foundations of one of the most prestigious construction projects of the time. Located near the modern city of Shiraz, it would become known as Persepolis, meaning Persian city in Greek. All its palaces rose from one stone platform designed to exemplify the unity of the empire.
The terrace square is huge, over 125,000 square meters. And he had to modify the landscape. His engineers had to come in and level out part of the area, and they had to build a retaining wall. He wanted it to be seen from a distance. That's exactly why you build up a terrace, so it could be viewed from afar. That makes it all the more grand and imposing.
Persepolis was a colossal engineering challenge, with walls more than 60 feet high and 30 feet thick. Its halls were held up by intricately decorated columns. Thousands of architects, craftsmen, and laborers, along with tons of material, were brought from the far corners of the empire. Most ancient monuments were built by slaves, but Darius, like Cyrus, believed in paying the workforce.
Every worker was given his due, his or her due, because we also find women in the workforce as well. Depending on their skill, what the quality they brought to the work, they were paid accordingly.
No expense was spared. Persepolis was intended to be the signature monument to Persian grandeur.
First of all, it's important to remember the origin of the Persians themselves. That is to say that these were a nomadic people. They lived in tented accommodation, and they would up their tents, move somewhere else, and plant their tents again. Now, as time went on, these tents became more and more elaborate affairs. And essentially what we're having at Persepolis is a tent turned into stone. The Apadana is nothing more than a stone tented building.
The Apadana was the magnificent reception chamber.
Each of those great monumental stone pillars are inspired by the kinds of wooden pillars that upheld a beautiful canvas roof. But now that canvas roof has turned to beautiful cedar wood instead. So the nomadic origins of the Persians gives the impetus to part of their architecture, but that's not all.
The palaces were adorned with gold and silver, expensive tapestries, and brightly colored ceramic tiles. The walls were graced with carved relief friezes depicting scenes of visiting dignitaries from conquered lands offering their tributes. The spectacular engineering achievements of Persepolis extended beyond the city walls. Its efficient water and drainage system was unrivaled anywhere in the ancient world.
Before the actual soil was placed in, first, Darius's engineers constructed a drainage system, plumbing, drain pipes. These would be covered. Water was also brought in along the Qanat system. But then those drain pipes, which would drain the effluents out, those were taken underground below the surface where the visitor would never see that.
Even during the speed-driven progress of the building boom to enhance the empire's infrastructure, Darius never slowed the pace of the expansion of its territory.
Under the brilliant leadership of Darius, the Persian Empire grew to staggering size. It included modern Iran and Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, Armenia, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, parts of Central Asia, all the way to northern India. And man, this is a lot of turf.
In the reign of Darius the Great, the Persian Empire grew to staggering proportion. What he then needed to do was consolidate and connect its far-flung elements. In 515 BC, engineers were commissioned to construct a stone highway that would tie the territory together, all the way from North Africa to India. Extending over 1,500 miles, Darius called it the Royal Road.
This was quite the engineering feat because this had to traverse through mountains, forests, deserts. So typically, earth would be packed, hardened, for example. They may not have had asphalt, but they certainly had knowledge of packing gravel or tiny rocks.
Laying down a stone road is vital in a terrain where there could be a high water table. You don't want to get your feet stuck in the mud. You don't want to get your cart stuck in the mud. So you have to raise the road surface up. That means laying down some kind of surface initially that will either absorb the groundwater or not allow the groundwater to displace the road.
The Royal Road was punctuated by 111 staging posts where travelers could eat, sleep, and switch to fresh horses. To ensure a safe journey, watchmen were posted along all its great length.
Now, I'm going to talk with my friend, Dr. Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones from the University of Edinburgh, professor of ancient history. I got to ask you this. Was it that safe?
Essentially, yeah. I think what Darius, if you will, manages to do here is an incredible feat. I mean, we're standing here in Turkey, okay,
right,
and we could take one route straight the way through into central Iran. I mean, that's pretty good going.
How fast?
Okay, so if we're on horseback and we're riding from one of these little garrisons to garrison every 15 miles, changing fresh horses, we can do that in about 6-7 days, maybe.
6 or 7 days?
Yeah.
So you could send messages on this road? Friends, next city?
Most definitely. And, you know, and for trade, it's a godsend, as you can imagine. And this road cut through so much stuff. I mean, it just doesn't follow, you know, a formal pathway. It has to cross rivers, so it crosses the Tigris, it crosses
by
the
ferry,
River Hannes,
right?
by ferry, right. Sometimes it clings to the side of mountains, sometimes it clings to the side of rivers, so the terrain is changeable. It's not drained or anything like that, so it's not as advanced as some of the Roman roads we get in later periods.
So it doesn't have a gutter system?
No, nothing like that, nothing like that. But what it's essentially is, it's sort of maybe 20 feet wide with a sort of chip-in base, which is good for horse treads and that kind of stuff, you know.
And carriages and
exactly, to
chariots.
get things through as quickly as you can, basically.
Well, Lloyd, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Yeah, thank you for enlightening us about this incredible road.
But Darius still hadn't finished. There was one territory he had yet to bring under Persian control, the vast expanse of North Africa. And he was determined to create a gateway into it. He asked his engineers to create a canal to link the Mediterranean with the Red Sea.
Everyone has heard of the Suez Canal, but how many have heard of Darius's canal? What Darius did was build an east-west canal that was 130 miles long.
Utilizing their sophisticated understanding of hydrology, the engineers used tools made of bronze and iron to first dig the basin and then clear it of blown sand. Finally, the canal was lined with stone, ready for ships to sail down it. 7 years were needed to complete the 130-mile-long waterway, using an enormous number of Egyptian stonecutters.
Parts of the canal between the Nile and the Red Sea were actually not waterways, but just points along which the ships could be dragged until they reached another deeper portion where they could again sail their course.
Darius says, I, Darius, king of kings, conqueror of Egypt, built this canal. He connected the Red Sea to the Nile River for trade, and he says, and ships were brought along my canal.
By 513 BC, Persia was the largest empire the world had ever seen, even exceeding the size and wealth of Rome at its height 4 centuries later. Persia was invincible, and its appetite for conquest was beginning to worry an emerging power across the Mediterranean, the Federation of the City-States of Greece.
Just a little geographical info. That big body of water out there is the Black Sea. This thin body of water here is the Bosphorus Strait that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. So I'm standing in Asia, or Asia Minor, if you will, and that land over there is Europe. Darius put down a revolt from some cities on the coast of Turkey, but this revolt had been supported by Athens, so Darius wanted to teach Athens a lesson. He was going to march on Greece and attack that city, but how is he going to do it? He's got to go across the sea. Well, he takes a bridge of boats, pontoons, if you will, and lines them up from that point to that point and marches an army, so Herodotus says, of 70,000 men across the sea to attack Greece. Amazing.
Persian engineers connected one side of the Bosphorus to the other by lashing boats together side by side to form a foundation. Then they built a road across the top, thus joining Asia to Europe.
Probably this was a system of planks, and underneath there was a system of packed earth or perhaps dry wood to keep basically the road stable. Now, to keep the ships from wobbling, they must have used an anchor system of a certain weight, because if the anchor would have been too heavy, that would have, of course, tilted or damaged the ships. There was no breaking of the planks, not only due to the weight of the army crossing it, but due to the choppy waters of the Bosphorus. That's quite the feat of engineering before the age of computers.
It is late August in the year 490 BC. Darius has already marched into Greece and taken Macedonia. Now he's destined to meet the Greek general Themistocles and an army from Athens and Corinth at the famous Battle of Marathon. The massive army from Persia numbers 60,000 or 140,000, 250,000, depending upon the propaganda you read. Suffice it to say, the Greeks are outnumbered 10 to 1. Their only recourse is to send for reinforcements. So the legendary runner Philippides runs from Marathon to Sparta, a distance of 140 miles in 2 days, hence the name of the race, Marathon.
On the 15th of September, 489 BC, the two armies faced each other across a vast open plain. If they clashed head-on, the Persian forces would annihilate the outnumbered Greeks. This battle would mark the beginning of the Persian Wars. A small Greek force attacked the Persians head-on. The Persians went in for an easy kill. But the remaining Greek armies had split into two and opened separate fronts against the enemy. Sucked into a pit of slaughter, the Persians suffered heavy losses and retreated. For the Greeks, it was an unalloyed triumph. For the Persians, just a blip on their path to world domination. Darius decided to return home and turn his attention to extending Persepolis, his favorite capital city. But this he would never achieve. In 486 BC, Darius died on his way to quell a revolt in Egypt, leaving to his son an empire that redefined the parameters of political authority. He also prevented a replay of the chaos that followed the death of Cyrus by naming that son, Xerxes, as his successor.
Now, Cyrus the innovator and Darius the expansionist were very hard acts to follow. But Xerxes had been a king in waiting all of his life, and a couple of his first acts were to suppress a rebellion in Babylon, another one in Egypt. And then he went after the Greeks. Somehow the Greeks just stuck in his craw. Some historians argue that Xerxes was making a preemptive strike. Others say that he was just cleaning up the business of his father. Whatever the case, the Greeks were no longer intimidated or impressed by the Persians since they'd beaten them at Marathon. And so Xerxes buddied up with the Carthaginian navy and the tip of what is now modern Tunisia, and he decided to beat the Greeks at sea.
480 BC. The Persian Empire was at its peak, huge, immensely powerful, and incredibly rich. It had been 10 years since the upstart federation of Greek city-states defeated Darius the Great at the Battle of Marathon. His son, Xerxes, had become the next absolute ruler of the Achaemenid dynasty, and Xerxes wanted revenge. Greece was just beginning to emerge as a force to be reckoned with. It was a coalition of profoundly differing city-states, some democracies and some dictatorships. They were united by one thing only, their hatred of Persia. The world was on the brink of the Second Persian War. The outcome would lay the foundations of the modern world.
Greeks traditionally called everybody except themselves barbarians. So this whole thing really between East and West started probably with the Persians and the Greeks and continued ever since.
The Persian invasion of Greece proved to be one of the most successful collaborations between strategy and engineering in military history. The invasion was a complicated land and sea assault, which demanded some radical construction projects. Xerxes wanted his army to invade Greece at the isthmus of Mount Athos. But as the currents there were treacherous, the king commanded his builders to dig a canal right across the isthmus. With their vast experience of canal building, the engineers took a mere 6 months to complete it. But the next problem facing both generals and architects was even more hazardous. The huge Persian army still had to cross the 1.5-mile-wide Hellespont. To this day, their solution to the problem is considered one of the boldest ever conceived for a military campaign. Taking a leaf out of his father's book, Xerxes suggested a double pontoon bridge to straddle the Hellespont, a feat of engineering that would far surpass the bridge Darius built over the Bosphorus.
But what's very interesting is that 674 ships were now lined up. How were these ships kept stable? This must have been quite an engineering feat. The Bosphorus is not a very calm area. It can be quite choppy. The row of ships were kept in place with a very taut system of cables, probably 2 large cables that ran between Asia and Europe. Now remember, a large number of troops crossed this bridge, perhaps up to 240,000 troops.
The cables gave the boats stability, but also flexibility of movement needed in the choppy waters. Each section of the bridge was built on 2 boats which were connected by planks, so the entire roadway could ride the waves, absorbing much of the surface turbulence. A platform across the top of the boats was then laid down, and then the roadway on top of that. A superhighway emerged, crossing the entire Hellespont and using battleships as its foundation.
Remember, we're dealing with the hooves of tens of thousands of cavalry, including armored cavalry, which would have been much, much heavier. The ships were amazingly kept stable, so this allowed Xerxes to cross with his army into Europe and cross back when he needed to, and the ships were kept in place. And for a short period, Europe and Asia were one.
10 days later, the bridge was writ into Europe.
The whole army crossed with heavy equipment, heavy cavalry, and the planks were kept in place. There was no breaking of the planks, not only due to the weight of the army crossing it, but due to the choppy waters of the Bosphorus.
Xerxes' strategy was simple: overwhelm the Greeks on land and at sea by sheer weight of numbers. Once again, the Greek armies were led by Themistocles. He knew he couldn't defeat Xerxes on land, so his entire campaign was designed to lure the Persian navy into a trap. Unseen by the Persians, Themistocles left the field with most of his army, leaving only a token force of 6,000 very brave Spartans. In August 480 BC, the 2 armies met at a spot chosen by the Greeks, at Thermopylae, a mountain pass so narrow only 1 chariot could travel through it at a time. For days, the Persian army was stalled, bottlenecked on the wrong side of the pass, just as planned. Like his father before him, Xerxes was about to charge headlong into a Greek trap. When they finally broke through the narrow gorge, the Persians pulverized the brave Spartans, heroically left there as bait, and marched on to Athens. But when they reached the city, it was deserted. Xerxes suspected he'd been duped, and he would make the Athenian people pay for it. For generations, mercy towards their vanquished enemies had been the hallmark of the Persian victors. Not this time. In a very uncharacteristic act of cruelty, Xerxes burned Athens to the ground. He regretted it immediately, and the following morning he ordered that Athens be restored. But it was too late. The deed was done. That moment of insensate rage would come back to haunt Persia nearly 200 years later. But in the blistering heat of August 479 BC, the present war was still far from over. At the same time, Themistocles was setting the trap that lured the Persian navy into the narrow bay at Salamis. Then he unleashed a surprise attack. The Persian fleet was caught in the naval equivalent of gridlock. It couldn't maneuver in the tiny bay, and the Greeks used their heavy triremes as battering rams to demolish the Persian ships. It was a decisive victory for the Greek Federation. Xerxes returned home defeated, head of a Persian empire that was no longer invincible.
There is one high note in the Persian loss against the Greeks at the Battle of Salamis, one saving grace, a woman named Artemisia, the sole female Navy captain in the Persian fleet. She faked out the Greeks by ramming one of her own losing ships, and she sailed away to escape in the confusion. Her survival skills so impressed Xerxes that he was thought to have said, "My men are becoming women, and my women are becoming men."
The Persian Wars propelled Athens into its own golden age, but left the colossal Persian Empire weakened and distinctly vulnerable. It would be left to a young prince, an ardent worshipper of Persia's immortal rulers, to deal it a final death blow. In 480 BC, the Greeks had defeated the Persian fleet at Salamis. The aura of invincibility that surrounded the empire evaporated. Nevertheless, there were days of triumph still to come. In 465 BC, the Persian king Xerxes died. The crown was inherited by his son Artaxerxes, who was determined to restore the empire to its former glory. He began by devoting his attention to a building project begun by his grandfather Darius. 4 decades after it was founded, Persepolis, the magnificent capital city, was still not finished. Artaxerxes set to oversee one of the final great engineering projects of the Persian Empire. Today, we know it as the Hall of 100 Columns.
We know that the actual hall was some 200 by 200 feet, almost on the perfect square.
What's remarkable with the Persepolis columns is when you look up the entire shaft, and these things raise, hundreds of feet into the air, there is not one piece of displacement whatsoever. It's a perfect vertical. They're working with what we might consider to be primitive tools, just stone mallets and bronze chisels, that's all. The fluting on the columns of Persepolis is so precise, however, that these are clearly the work of master craftsmen. The columns are constructed in drums, 7 or 8 drums stacked on top of another. This is done by scaffolding the whole area around the column, and then with a crane, a wooden crane, literally moving each column drum in place.
Any client king, any governor from a distance, or even anyone who would come in that hall would be so impressed by the vastness of the hall and by this forest of columns that stretched nearly as far as the eye could see. An amazing achievement.
Across the empire, Persians were still producing some of the most extraordinary feats of engineering in the ancient world. In 353 BC, the wife of a provincial governor began work on a tomb for her dying husband at Halicarnassus. Her tribute to him would be a marvel of engineering and would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was the mausoleum of Mausolus, and gave us our word mausoleum. The marble monument rose to a height of 135 feet. Ionic columns enclosed a courtyard containing the tomb. The roof was pyramidal, with a staircase on each side representing pathways to the afterlife. In modern times, the tomb of the American President Ulysses S. Grant in New York City was modeled on the mausoleum of Mausolus. In the 4th century BC, Persian engineering was still the most advanced in the world. But underneath the soaring columns and glittering palaces, the empire's political and military foundations were crumbling, and enemies were baying for blood at its gates.
When Athens supports a rebellion in Egypt and Greeks occupy the capital city of Memphis, Artaxerxes leaves Persepolis and his building projects, and he launches a military campaign to kick the Greeks out of Memphis and bring Egypt back under Persian control once again. It'll be the last great victory of the Persian Empire, Because in 424 BC, Artaxerxes dies, leaving a power vacuum and 8 solid decades of rampant infighting and neglect. And while the Persian Empire is embroiled in internal conflict and corruption, a young Macedonian prince is studying Herodotus and the accounts of the great Persian hero Cyrus the Great. And this Macedonian prince will set his eyes on conquering the world. His name is Alexander.
In 336 BC, a distant relative of Artaxerxes took the reins of power. He assumed a regal title, Darius III, but he will always be remembered as the king who lost an empire. Over the following 4 years, Alexander and Darius III met head-to-head in a series of pitched battles. The Persian army was relentlessly pushed back into its own heartland. In 330 BC, Alexander was camped outside the gates of Persepolis.
Alexander adopted the Persian policy of respecting the defeated. None of his soldiers were allowed to pillage or plunder the lands they had conquered. But how do you tame so many soldiers after a victory over the most magnificent empire on planet E? Well, maybe his soldiers were restless or resentful, or maybe they just remembered the stories of how Athens had been burned by the Persians. In any case, at Persepolis, they let go. Huge celebrations took place after the victory, and during these celebrations, the treasury was pillaged. And then one of the saddest acts of arson in all of history took place. Persepolis was burned.
Alexander was not in the business of destroying things. Persepolis probably was burned because it was a symbolic thing. And he also burned it to make a symbolic gesture, not a destructive gesture.
There must have been wonderful draperies and things around, and no doubt fire could have begun accidentally just as much as purposefully, because if he really wanted to be an Achaemenid king, the last thing he should want to do was to destroy Persepolis. But there were no fire engines, and once the blaze had taken hold, it was a very terrible blaze, and it left its mark throughout the site.
Darius III evaded capture, but in the summer of 330, he was murdered by one of his own allies. The last Achaemenid king was dead. Alexander gave Darius a magnificent funeral, and later he married his daughter. Alexander declared himself an Achaemenid Persian king, and so wrote the final chapter in the story of an empire that spanned 3 continents and endured for over 2,700 years.
Alexander, admirer of Persian kings, chased down the murderers of Darius and killed them himself. Alexander believed that only kings had the right to kill kings. But would have Alexander actually killed Darius? Probably not, because Alexander didn't create an empire, he only conquered one. The empire already existed, created by Cyrus the Great. No, Alexander's genius was to co-opt and use Persia, an empire that stood long before Alexander was born, and whose legacy of culture and sophistication and luxury would be around long after Alexander was dead. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.